and lack thereof, and recaffeinated at a late part in your day. I just want to make a programmatic note that after this this panel tonight, we will. Okay. All right, there. Those who wish can adjourn to the faculty center, which is just like a few, like a couple blocks walk down the quad, and there will be adult beverages and food of various types, all of which sounded delicious. So please join us. That, of course, will just flow until we're out. So please come down about 5:30 to 7:30 this evening if you've got the stamina. We'd love to have you. So we're going to close out the afternoon with a plenary panel, which is really another opportunity, having so many of these different constituencies and different voices represented from so many different perspectives at this event, to hear from a group that I really don't get to hear that much from in this way. And I thought that given that it might be an interesting perspective to provide here, and that is the voice and the observations and experiences of panelists who in various ways, I think you can say, cover the beat of content moderation in different ways. And we'll get into the ways that manifests once we speak to them. But before we get to that point, and to introduce our participants on this afternoon's panel, I would like to have the pleasure of introducing a close colleague and my co-moderator this afternoon, Dr. Safiya Noble, who is an assistant professor at the Annenberg School of Communication at the moment, and also has held that position here in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. And so please welcome Safiya Noble. Many of you know her work. She is an expert and scholar in the area of racial bias and search, and she has a book forthcoming from NYU any minute now, entitled Algorithms of Oppression, and you can give me the $5 for that later. It's
Thank
cool.
you.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
So thank you and welcome, Safiya.
Tweet that out later. It's fine.
You.
All right. Thank you all. So great to see you. So many friends and people that I know and follow on Twitter here. So just honored to be in your presence, in your company today. And I'm already learning so much. I'm really delighted to introduce our three panelists this afternoon, and I think you're going to enjoy them. So I'm going to call you up in order of introduction, and when I introduce you, you can come on up. And this is in no order of priority other than how I'm holding the program. So that's it. All right. Let's start with Lauren Weber. Lauren writes about employment and workplace issues for the Wall Street Journal, where her coverage has included the evolution of contracting and contingent work, the use of sophisticated pre-hire assessments, the mystery of what happens to a resume when a candidate submits an online job application. I know no one in here has ever had that experience. And controversies surrounding the classification of independent contractors as employees, among many others. So let's welcome Lauren Weber to the stage / table in front of us. Thanks, Lauren. Olivia Solon is a San Francisco-based journalist who focuses on technology and digital culture. She's currently a senior reporter at The Guardian and has previously held senior editorial roles at Wired UK, The Mirror, and Bloomberg Business Europe. I know many of you know Olivia because she's always the first thing we read when we wake up in the morning and see The Guardian in our inbox, which is pretty much me. So thanks, Olivia. Come on up. We're really looking forward to hearing from you too. And last but certainly not least, because you were actually on the first page of presenters, but I had it unfolded wrong. David Ingram is a technology correspondent for Reuters News in San Francisco, who writes about the social media industry and its impact on business, politics, and culture. Since joining Reuters in 2011, he has also reported on the U.S. Department of Justice, antitrust enforcement, and white-collar crime, which I feel like is pretty much all there is to report about these days. Let's welcome David up to the panel, too. Thanks, David. And Sarah, I'm going to kick it back to you to get us going today.
Thanks. So, Safiya, just make sure your mic is on, but I think everybody else should have hot mic, and we can Yeah, so we can, we're going to go a little bit more informal at the end of the day, just to have kind of a different experience and exchange from the traditional academic talks. And one of those reasons is that we want to seed as soon as we can to engagement with all of you who are here. And we know it's, you know, it's getting dark, it's getting late in the day, so that
it actually got darker in this room.
Well, Patricia didn't. She gave us some mood lighting, so that's
thanks.
okay.
Thanks, Patricia.
I don't know. I think it's fine. Is everybody okay? Great. I mean, frankly, do I look better when in the shadow?
I mean, everybody does better with a little mood lighting.
Yeah,
this is saying. It's not a crime.
So what we would like the agenda to be today is to first of all, we'll just. This thing keeps cutting out. We'll go down the panel here and give each one of you an opportunity, and we'd welcome your own contextualization of the work that you do in the context that you do. So we have 3 different news organizations with some very distinct identities, so that's at play here. You are covering some different things and have different purviews in the work that you do. But of course, you're all assembled here today around this issue of content moderation because in one way or another, your work has encountered this topic, dealt with it. You have been thinking about it journalistically. And so we want to talk about that, but also later on, we're going to talk more broadly about what it means to be covering some of these issues when perhaps that isn't an easy task. So that's kind of what I will shore up. But to kick it off, I'd like to give each one of you an opportunity just to say a little bit about how or where or why you fall in this topic and what it is that you do in the news organization where you're working now. Kind of what's your mandate and how might you come to some of these issues. So I'll offer it up to whomever wants to start because I don't want to pick on anyone. Anybody want to kick it off for us? Thanks, Lauren.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm kind of the outlier here, and actually I'm a last minute replacement for my colleague Deepa, who was supposed to be on the panel and couldn't make it at the last minute. She covers Facebook and other social media companies. I cover workplace and employment issues, so I come at this from a very different point of view, and only recently started looking at content moderation, and that's partly because I've been, as my bio said, I've been writing a lot of stories about contract employment and contingent employment. And I probably got into it at the same time in the same way that most reporters covering some of these issues got into it, like looking at the gig economy as Uber was blowing up, et cetera. I was writing lots of stories about Uber and the lawsuit that Uber is facing about whether or not drivers are independent contractors or employees and those kinds of issues. And I had some very smart sources schooling me. Many, some saying, often academics, often economists saying, you're all kind of missing the point here. The gig economy is a tiny fraction of the workforce. There are much more interesting models of how labor is evolving that everybody's kind of missing. And they were talking specifically about contracting, and that means sort of people who are doing the work of companies who are not their employers, but they actually have an employer. So they're missed in a lot of the ways that data is collected. So they are W-2 employees of someone, but not the company whose work they're doing. And, you could say sort of like, okay, who cares if it's just a shell game? These are people who have jobs. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, they probably have insurance. They're employees in the traditional sense. But there are a lot of implications for these sort of arm's length employment relationships, whether it's looking at wages or the quality of benefits or work identities. When you're an employee working on a campus, but you're not employed by the company whose campus you're on. There are some interesting professional identity issues that come up, issues about career path when we used to have like this sort of, tell me if I'm going on too long. We used to have the sort of mailroom to CEO myth and story. Well, now mailrooms are outsourced to third-party companies. So the person who's potentially going to promote you, they might promote you within the company, the mailroom company or this mailroom services company. You're not necessarily going to be promoted up through the ranks of the company whose mail you're sorting. So there are a lot of like interesting labor issues. And I started getting interested in content moderation in part because I think it is a fascinating look at how some of these labor models are intersecting, that you have crowdsourcing, you have FTEs, full-time employees, you have contract employees, you have independent contractors. All of that is happening at once. And I think that's partly because there are all these issues of how to scale this work, how to scale quickly. There are cost issues. There are, sort of all of this, I think, is leading to a lot of experimentation in who's actually doing the work. So it's a very interesting model. It's a very interesting workforce to look at when you think about the way labor is structured now.
Okay, I think I'll just leave it there. Well, no, maybe I'll leave it there. So I wanted to talk about kind of 3 ways that I'm sort of been involved in this in some shape or form. When I was at Wired UK, we used to actually moderate all of our own comments. So not necessarily on your own story, but we would do it in-house. And we had quite strict moderation policies, and it was essentially kind of be nice and no ad hominem attacks and try and have a productive conversation. But doing it was a kind of a grueling and overwhelming task, and we were a relatively small website. So I got quite a keen understanding of how challenging a problem it is, even on quite a small and relatively niche website. It was particularly challenging on opinion pieces by women on the site, which was quite difficult. But yeah, so I kind of have a sense of what that was like. The second point I wanted to bring up was I recently kind of was embroiled in I kind of became a bit of a news story on a very minor level because of an algorithmic decision-making fail on behalf of Facebook, which related to a rape threat I got about a year ago, which I screenshotted and posted to my Instagram with here's my latest fan mail kind of thing. I didn't actually feel particularly threatened. I'm very used to receiving rape and death threats, unfortunately. I'd received it over, an anonymous email. And I posted it, forgot about it, and then I was on vacation in Santa Barbara on a hike, and my sister texted me. And she texted me a screenshot of her Facebook, and what she was seeing was what I assumed to be one of my most engaging photos from Instagram being used as an advertisement, effectively, to entice my sister over to Instagram. And that photo was the screenshot of my rape threat. So I then screenshotted that and tweeted it, and that kind of went a bit viral. And then my editor's like, we want to write a story about this, and that was very strange because I don't like being the story. And then finally, a lot of my coverage at The Guardian recently has been about online content moderation. I focused initially quite a lot on the people doing the work, these low-paid contractors, and the kind of emotional toil of looking at very distressing images. Because I'm based in San Francisco, we did a lot of, the focus has been on Facebook and Google and Twitter, but I've also spoken to other organizations like NECMEC and IWF, looking at how they deal with tackling child sex abuse imagery and the level of training that those people get versus the level of training that the contractors at these big tech companies get. And then separately, I was involved in, we called it the Facebook files, but it was like we published the guidelines issued to train content moderators at Facebook. And so we kind of dug into that and trying to see what an enormous challenge companies like Facebook have on their hands, trying to distill all of these societal problems into a sort of almost programmatic decision tree when there's so much cultural nuance. And so yeah, hopefully we try to explore that a little bit. Yeah.
Hi everyone, and thank you to Sarah and to the other organizers for putting on the event. I came to commercial content moderation fairly recently. I've been a reporter for what I think of as a long time, but for most of my career, I've been a legal reporter, so primarily covering legal stories out of New York and Washington having to do with antitrust, white collar crime, sort of any legal subject under the sun that you could think of. I probably wrote a story about it at some point, which was fun because they say that all the good stories at some point end up in the courts. And that's certainly happening right now on white collar crime. But long ago I covered state politics in North Carolina, so I have like a totally different set of perspectives from that experience. And I've been covering tech for a fairly short period of time, so for a little less than a year. And I started to look at this issue because it became clear almost immediately after I started writing about tech that this was a dominant subject within the industry. So I cover primarily social media, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and others. And for all of them, this has flared up again and again in the months that I and others have been writing about it the past year or so. So I started writing about Facebook back in March. Very soon afterward is when we started to see the proliferation of the use of Facebook Live to post violent videos, including murders and suicides. And Wall Street Journal did a great story at one point, tallying up all the just Deepa, I think, tallying up all the different instances that it had flared up and at some point appeared in the media. I don't have to go through all the other recent examples, but this is I sort of look at it from a couple different perspectives as a reporter, and that comes from sort of Reuters being a kind of an unusual organization within the media. We are what you'd call a wire service, or some people internationally call it a news agency. So we typically we're selling news to other media clients, and our focus is less on directly informing consumers and providing news organizations with the stories they need. So The Guardian is a client, for example, but we have a lot of different needs. So I approach a lot of the subject and others from a business standpoint, but also from a political and sort of standpoint of the exploitation of workers is a subject that I'm interested in and want to write more about. So I try to sort of write a variety of stories that look at different angles of the subject, and also looking at it from the standpoint of how do the companies actually go about making these decisions too, because I think a lot of that is still somewhat, at least you could say, hidden from view about how the companies comes to these decisions. So.
Okay, I'm going to kick it off. And I'm going to start with the question that I feel like is often on the minds of a lot of academics, because this is primarily an academic crowd, just to get it over with for you all right? And then we can move forward. So one of the challenges that I think many academics have is that with the exception of you all, they know a lot. They've kind of given their lives to studying some of the kinds of things that you all are picking up topically. And I know that there's often kind of this relationship between academics and journalists, right? Where on one level studies are happening and you're picking up those studies and you're citing them and you're amplifying to some degree the work that many people have kind of given their lives to. What's your advice for the people, for example, in this room who are interested in being partners with the media and kind of amplifying a set of concerns, bringing into view things that previously might have been hidden? I think about the people in the room who've been talking about and thinking about commercial content moderation or content moderation for many years, for whom now this is kind of like my mother-in-law knows that content moderation is going on, right? I mean, like nobody knew about that before, but it's because journalists have done such a phenomenal job of kind of bringing these things out. And I think there are many people who might be interested in kind of a whole set of concerns around technology writ large, social media, who are interested in this kind of relationship, this amplification, how to enhance the relationship, how to kind of work to solve some of the kinds of problems that you all are also exploring. Is that a fair question? Because I feel like some people might be bombarding you for your cards later. I'm just throwing that out.
Yeah, I think the question, just to crystallize it, would be, from a journalistic perspective, what are the expectations for you? What are you looking for from academe and other areas that you rely upon, and what should academics who work in these areas who might find themselves suddenly receiving calls from some of you or your colleagues for whom that might be a new experience, how should that relationship be negotiated? And then we'll get actually back to the substance, but thank you for that question. Any advice?
I may regret saying this, but my email is david.ingram@reuters.
Whoa.
But seriously, so I think, just speaking for myself, I think I think this is an underreported area. I think there are going to be a lot more stories written on these subjects. I think all three of us are probably hoping to write a lot of them, and this is an area where I think it is particularly hard to find good information because, from our standpoint, because a lot of the workers who are actually doing the work on the ground are they're covered by NDAs, and so if they talk to us, they are taking a pretty severe risk of losing their jobs, or what other penalties there might be. And the companies are often black boxes, and so we rely in part on the work of academics who do understand this, either because they've gotten access or they have found ways to study it. And I may regret again saying this, but like, I'm not turning down any story ideas at the moment on this subject.
Check your inbox. I would say the same thing. Come and chat to us after this. I'm very open to that and always looking for stories. The other thing that frequently we're looking for is just kind of going for context, and often sort of stories flare up around content moderation when there's like an isolated incident, whether it's Napalm Girl or some inappropriately placed ad, or like the monetization of weird child abuse on YouTube. And it'll be an anecdote that which needs contextualizing, and the kind of rigor of academia often provides that. So it's a kind of two-way thing. Pitch me your stories, but also I'm always looking for people with expertise in this area to come to comment on sort of more breaking news stuff.
We rarely will write about a story about an academic paper, occasionally, but it's rare. So it's more like sort of beginning the dialogue, letting us know, what you're working on. I'm lauren.weber1b@wsj.com. And then, making sure that it's great when there's a relationship in place, so that when I am ready to write about a topic, or there's some breaking news happens where you've got to find people fast, you know who to call. That said, I find that my editors often have a bias against quoting academics, which bothers me a lot, partly because I come from a family of academics, but also because I feel like it's really important to give credit where credit is due. So, but it's because they want the primary sources. So they want the company sources and the workers and the, this and that. And so it's sometimes a struggle to make sure that academics who bring us really, really important insights and analysis get their credit. So, I've had quotes taken out of stories, and then I've had academics, sort of feel like I stole their ideas, and I feel terrible when that happens. But so I do try to make sure credit is given.
Thanks. I'd like to return to something that a note that David, you ended on as you gave us your context and a little bit about the work that you do, and you mentioned that the practices with regard to content moderation that you find yourself trying to cover tend to be hidden from view. And I wanted to get right into the nature of the work that I believe all three of you do to a certain extent, which is to attempt to cover topics or specific examples or practices, et cetera, that are in one way or another rendered somewhat inaccessible to you. And I wonder if you can speak to that and maybe speak to the ways in which, since you come from varied backgrounds, the way in which you find that this topic is singular in that regard or shares commonalities with other the industrial sectors or practices, and just get your input and feedback on that. And I should say that I think, it is somewhat received wisdom that it's difficult to cover. So maybe you can say something about that. Maybe that's not necessarily it's that simple. Anybody?
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I thought the Guardian's done some of the really great work in obtaining some of the documents that guide at least one of the company in the space, along with I think ProPublica and maybe others in getting some of the hidden documents. I mean, I think we all previously knew that there were thick guidebooks in these companies for that elaborate on all the rules that you see the skeleton of if you go to their policies online. But until someone leaks them, a lot of us, including everyone else in this room, essentially is in the dark about what they say. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll talk a bit about it. I mean, yeah, we've relied quite a lot on leaks and sources who've come to us on the condition that they can speak anonymously. And that has been incredibly helpful, but it was a hard slog getting some of those contacts. And obviously, you kind of guard. Often it's people who've just left their very low paid job, and while they're working there, although I have had quite a few people contact me who are still working in these companies, it's a very high risk move, and frequently they have software installed that will detect if they've taken screenshots and things like that. So we have to be mindful to protect sources and give them the advice they need to kind of protect themselves. But then there's, and then you get the leaked documents, and I think there's a big difference between the sort of the policies as they should be and then the implementation of the policies. And I think that's where a lot of the problems arise. So, you can debate whether you agree that Facebook or YouTube or Twitter should allow this type of content or that, but then often it's a mishap with the algorithm detecting child nudity that it causes the biggest furore. So, yeah, I've sort of lost my train of thought. But I think, yeah, it's even having the information doesn't mean that even having the information of the policies doesn't mean that there mistakes aren't still made. But without having that information, we can't even debate it. And given that these companies now control so much of the public sphere, I do think it's increasingly important to have, be able to debate whether we think that these are the right policies or not.
I only recently started covering this area, and I don't cover the companies themselves. So my sources are not, like I don't have company sources and that kind of thing, which you do have when you're a beat reporter on a certain industry or company. But I have found that once you start writing about it, I also have not published a single story about content moderation. But once you do start publishing, and all of us here have a very good platform for that, and our stories get, they get around, people start coming out of the woodwork. So that helps. And that's something I think academics don't have. You just get contacted by people who have a knowledge or experience. So that's really key. And yeah.
I'm curious to know too, how much the social media platforms themselves impact the type of work that you're doing, the circulation of it, the suppression of it, for example, if you have kind of your own experiences with thinking through, or your news organizations are kind of struggling about this relationship between tech firms, because there's one thing to write about it and kind of critique it or bring to light new dimensions of this labor, but also kind of these practices, but then also putting them in context with, say, something like what we see in the United States right now, that even this week, the largest transfer of wealth from the working and middle class to the 1%, to the elites, and how technology is actually implicated in those kinds of projects, either with the suppression of kind of information where people are, quite frankly, distracted and don't even realize that that's happening, or the kind of ways in which your own media organizations kind of can't break through with those messages. So I'm just curious, you may or may not be writing about those kinds of things, but I think it's interesting to see, for example, how social media platforms, the very things that you're writing about and kind of at the granular maybe level, might be amplified or connected to some of these larger social phenomena that we see. Too hard? Maybe I need to be more specific.
I'll take it.
Take it.
I mean, I think this was brought up a little bit today, but with most of these companies, we're talking about the advertising industry, and it has been very profitable for. I know a lot of people have been singling out Facebook today, and that's inevitable to some degree. And Facebook is really the only profitable social media company out there, unless you include Google, which I don't really do. But Facebook, I think last quarter had YouTube in some ways, but not really. Facebook last quarter had 10 billion in revenue, and 5 billion of that was profit. So that is that is, and they're growing by leaps and bounds still off that really huge base. Twitter has never had a profitable quarter, and neither has Snapchat. Yeah, I mean, San Francisco, I didn't live in San Francisco when the Facebook IPO happened, but everyone in the city says that San Francisco changed after the Facebook IPO. If anyone disagrees, feel free to speak up. But not just Facebook, but Apple and Alphabet and the others, these are sources of enormous wealth that is not being distributed evenly, and that wealth is coming from the power of those users who are 2 billion of us who aren't profiting from the shares. So I don't know if that gets quite at what you're. Yeah.
I would maybe add that these platforms have allowed for all types of new media or purporting like news organizations to attract huge audiences. And initially we've talked about gatekeepers, but news, the traditional media organizations were the news gatekeepers for a long time, and now if you look at Facebook or YouTube, the Guardian's articles, or all of our work, will appear in exactly the same format, alongside InfoWars, Breitbart, fake, whatever you want to call it, fake news, like conspiracy theories, all neatly packaged into the same design. And I think that makes it, I mean, I'm sure lots of people thought that before, but it does make it harder to, you sort of distinguish between fact and fiction. Not that traditional news organizations always get it right, but at least you have brand destinations, and you have an understanding of what a news brand stands for. And now, because the news follows the users rather than users don't go to the news organizations, I think that's created a pretty big challenge. And I don't know, I've gone down a rabbit hole with the story I'm working on at the moment into conspiracy theory territory, and on the first page of the results of the topic that I'm looking at in YouTube is just like a shit show of technical term, just like everything apart from one item on the first page of results is a conspiracy theory. But if you didn't know anything about the subject, that would be the version of the truth that you would see. And I don't know, I obviously don't know the solution, but I think it's a really big problem.
I'll just add that, I think, I can't remember exactly who said it. Some of you all probably know, information wants to be free, but reporters also want to get paid. So there is just a natural conflict in that. And I know, I think there is a love-hate relationship between publishers like the Wall Street Journal and the Guardian and Reuters and others, and social media, platforms that want to make that information available to their users. And I think that's all being still worked out.
So I'd love to open up the discussion to our audience for Q&A, if that would be okay with everyone. And I will run around with the mic once again. So if you would like to pose a question to any and all of our panelists, please, let's do it. All right, we gotta take her here.
Thanks so much for having this discussion. So I'm curious, especially for you two, where you've spent time on this topic for a little while, do you feel like you've seen a change in how the platforms or the representatives you end up speaking to are handling either the controversies or the press attention? And in particular, how was Facebook about the files? I'm curious, like you must have had to interact with them quite a bit. But it raises the bigger question about are they responding differently in the time that you've been reporting?
I mean, on the whole, whenever you flag a problem with, problematic content, and there's all, it comes in all shapes and forms, there's normally like, oops, we didn't know that was there, and we'll fix it. But over the years, I think Facebook's is probably thinking about this the hardest, from what I can tell from the outside. And they hire lots of good people in different areas of specialisms. But the problem is, we've started off and it was like, okay, we don't want child sexual abuse images. That's there's sort of legal definitions of those things. They are illegal. But then you get into things like terrorist propaganda, and so they were dealing with that and hiring a whole load of different specialists there. Then you've got into the fake news and misinformation and what's fake news, what's opinion, and that whole can of worms. And then more recently, I don't know if you saw with the YouTube weird algorithmically generated videos for kids, and then also weird videos that were sort of acting of sort of low level abuse of children, but not as in like, taping a child with duct tape to a chair, that kind of thing. It was actors, but it was weird and targeted at a kind of creepy audience. Like, what do you do with that? And I don't know what the answer is, but I would say that Facebook, with the Facebook files and all the stories I was working on, was generally pretty responsive. They were angry, I'm sure all the people in here, angry that we were publishing their guidelines because they felt that it would allow people to circumvent them, which is a fair comment, but it is the biggest, it's the biggest public sphere, I guess, online that we have, I think. And I do think that we need to be able to debate these things. And then another story that I had, which was relating to a counterterrorism team within Facebook made up of low-paid moderators, where their identities ended up getting exposed to the terrorist groups that they were moderating. They were also not that happy about me writing about that, but again, it was very much in the public interest, and I think kind of those stories where we're talking about low-paid contractors who are doing this grunt work and being blamed when mistakes are made, I feel like those are the people that we're kind of protecting. That sounds wanky. Sorry, I don't mean we're not protecting them, but we those are the people we're sort of raising awareness about, and hopefully, trying to ask these huge, very profitable tech companies to do more to protect them.
All right, right here.
Hi, thanks for the discussion. I wanted to ask about sort of what influences your decisions about sort of what kinds of companies to cover. So there's a lot of coverage on like the big major platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube. So what influenced your decision to sort of go into other sort of spaces that may not be used by as many people, but may have sort of something else to sort of offer or contribute to the discussion?
That's a really good question, and to be blunt about it, we don't write too much about social media companies that aren't Facebook, Twitter, and Snapchat, and that often does seem unfair because I could imagine the argument that it reinforces sort of the monopoly that those companies have on the discussion. There are obviously many other social networks that want to be that size, and I think the factors that we would look at, in deciding whether to write about them would be who's involved, how long have they been around, what are their distinguishing characteristics, what do they have interesting people behind them, either from academia or from the venture capital world, people who used to work at the bigger companies. And I think it sort of takes an idea that they're changing the game in some way or threaten to, that would get us to be interested in writing.
There's just such an enormous appetite for news about Facebook, Google, maybe Twitter, and so that's what our editors want. And that's because those companies affect our readers' lives. Like they're deeply embedded in our readers' lives. It's hard to make an argument for writing about companies that are not part of our readers' lives.
Just to add to that, not so much from the covering the company perspective, but with when I've been looking at the counterterrorism efforts of these big companies, you can't really have that conversation without talking about the small companies that don't have the resources of Facebook and YouTube and sort of Twitter, but they don't have the specialist counterterrorism teams. And actually, the propaganda, as it gets pushed off the big platforms with the better resources, gets pushed onto these, paste bin, or at the moment, Google Drive or Telegram, and where they've got a tiny team of content moderators. And so with things like child sexual abuse or terrorism, we end up sort of having to look at those issues and how the big companies can help the smaller companies tackle that problem, which they are trying to do.
Questions? All right, let me get over there.
Thank you. I didn't actually flip on, but then it's not on. Okay, infrastructure fixed. Two questions, quasi-related. One is, how does an algorithm make a mistake? Or why do we always talk about them as accidentally doing things that they are just meant to do? And can we stop that and just talk about them as machines and as decision-making machines, but that they don't make mistakes? We have a notion of a computer error. Like, we should be critical of that. Just because it allows corporations to shift responsibility for what they do onto these machines that are things they're not willing to take responsibility for or allow any kind of external auditing of. So we can then reblame, in a way, the corporations. One is, so how does an algorithm make a mistake? The second one is, I've been editing this, it's like an incredible piece by Whitney Phillips where she went out and interviewed 50 reporters about the effects of trolling on the things that, where you want to, Yeah, it's 23,000 words, so it's going to take me a couple of days to read. But one of the main things is that trolling works to convince reporters not to cover the beat of Facebook and Twitter and or other stories, right? And so I'm wondering how trolling affects the kind of stories you take up.
Okay, so when I said algorithm making a mistake, I guess, you know, there are algorithms that are it's clearly the company making the mistake, and I think you've sort of answered it in the question, but there are times when they are supposed to be doing, or at least the companies claim they're supposed to be doing one thing, and they don't do that accurately or with the cultural nuance required or expected by the users, and they're sort of bumbling through that. But for example, you know, you'd think that quite an easy AI problem to solve would be to identify an ISIS flag. But then you identify the flag, and then you have to work out whether this is an ISIS propaganda video or is it a news report. And it's getting down to that kind of, and it also even is it even an ISIS flag, full stop. And so there are different levels of where mistakes of judgment can happen, or machines can cock up, but then they're often reviewed by humans who can also make mistakes. So but ultimately, yeah, I don't know. I mean, can we make perfect algorithms that don't make mistakes on making very nuanced human decisions? That's above my pay grade. The other thing about trolling is it doesn't change what we cover, but I would say it makes me really brace myself. I've got a story I'm working on at the moment that I have gone for comment to some people who are mentioned in the piece, and even asking them for comment has elicited a huge amount of online harassment and people going through my Facebook profile and taking screenshots and sending them to me and sending threats. And so I know that when that story comes out, I'm going to have to deal with a whole load of harassment, and I'm probably going to shut down my social media accounts for a few days around that story. That is not a perfect solution, but it's a coping strategy, and it's one that I'm very likely going to be doing. But it doesn't, I have to, it doesn't change the fact that I want to cover this story, and it's an important story. It's just dealing with the backlash, and that relates, that can be about conspiracy theorists, it can be about the alt-right, it can be about, I don't know, was Gamergate in the past. There's a lot of issues that bring up this.
On the first question, I don't think algorithms make mistakes, and I think we're pretty good about not accepting that rhetoric when we do hear that from companies, and we do hear that from companies. I was rereading one of our stories earlier today, and we referenced I think it was last year that several Facebook pages related to Palestinian media were shut down, and Facebook described it as a mistake, but didn't elaborate on exactly how it was a mistake. And and we pointed this out in the story that there was a campaign by the Israeli government to persuade Facebook to shut down certain Facebook pages. And so I think we generally challenge companies when they try to use that language. And I do think that the companies do, when they are caught in a moment where the press is really focused on them, the companies frequently do provide a little bit more of a glimpse into their internal operations. I remember when the Vietnam napalm photo was taken down last year, and Facebook was a little bit more forthcoming about how it makes these decisions. And well, I don't know if they were forthcoming. More news came out about how Facebook makes these decisions, and they're going into the idea that there's like this group of people at the top of Facebook, including Sheryl Sandberg, who act as a sort of Supreme Court to rule on when either when there's an exception that needs to be made or considered. On the trolling question, I don't actually recall ever making a decision on a story based on trolling. I've had very little of that in my career for reasons that may appear obvious. But I do think. Yeah. No, I come from a place of privilege based on the fact that I'm a white man, and I understand that. But I also think that it may just be my turn coming. That I'll be writing a story at some point about a group that is active online that doesn't like journalists, and I'm sure I'll be, at some point in the future, I'll be targeted. So,
as we're wrapping up, kind of closing down on the last few minutes, I'm wondering if you can share with us, each of you, just kind of as our final closing thoughts, what's on the horizon? What do you think we need to be thinking about? Kind of taking in all that you cover in your beats, looking out kind of into the landscape. What do you think? What are you worried about? What are your kind of concerns? What are the things you think are going to need to be investigated more deeply, more thoroughly by you or others?
Well, obviously, I have a bias based on what I cover, but I would say the labor practices around this are very interesting and very opaque. I mean, I've been writing about contracting in many contracting and contingent work in many contexts. Content review is just one of them, and companies do not want to talk about this topic. They don't want to talk. I mean, first of all, the only bit of information they have to disclose about their workforce to the securities to the SEC is how many employees they have, and that usually means FTEs, and that number is basically meaningless right now because so many companies are relying on so many contingent workers. So they disclose almost nothing about their workforces, their workforce practices, etc. I think that and at a certain point, investors paid attention to a metric called revenue per employee. Well, that also is now totally meaningless. I reported in one of my first stories that Google has around 70,000 employees. Well, they have about an equal number of contractors. Google would not say a word to me about that and fought me tooth and nail on every bit of it. I have found it through, through other means. The fact that companies are so unwilling to discuss their workforce practices, I think only makes us more curious about them. And I think probably in the end kind of comes back to bite them in a way. I think it's very interesting that Facebook is here, that they're the only one of the big platforms that are here, that they're talking about some of these issues. I'm not sure I can publish some of that information, but I hope so. I think there will be more and more pressure for companies to talk about the working conditions, not just of content moderators, but more broadly.
I guess there's probably two things that I've been thinking about a lot. And the first is the sort of role of the kind of privatization of things that were privatization of intelligence, I guess. Previously, roles that governments would have be able to access certain communications platforms. Now you end up with this weird situation where you have companies that obviously have to protect the privacy of their users, but equally have huge demands being placed on them by governments to identify, for example, terrorists or state actors trying to spread propaganda. And I think the sort of handoff process between when it's the company's responsibility versus when it becomes a government responsibility is a very strange and very opaque one. And not, yeah, I think the sort of, there isn't, it's a weird, what I'm particularly interested there is the filtering up process from, and I'm going to use the counterterrorism as an example of where a Facebook moderator identifies something that looks like a terrorist or a terrorist traveling fighter, and then they pass that information to law enforcement even when there might not be a warrant, and how that process works is a strange one. The second thing I think is the flood of disinformation on these platforms, and how we tackle that when there are interested parties, state actors with enormous resources, abusing these systems in a way that is actually making it hard to distinguish between the truth and what's not the truth.
I definitely agree on that last point about disinformation and propaganda, and the company's ability or inability to root it out. I think interestingly, I think the strategy that the companies are using is actually less about content moderation in that sense, and more about looking at the account users, and trying to eliminate quote unquote fake accounts, and which is a strategy I'm not sure is going to totally work, but I think we'll all find out soon. I think there do seem to be as more situations come up and as companies respond to them, I think there are like more and more gray areas almost for each one of these in content moderation. So the lines are becoming more blurred as people come up with different exceptions, and I don't know whether the companies are going to want to keep allowing those lines to be blurred and creating exceptions to exceptions rather than trying to have black and white rules. The other really big thing I think I'm interested in is the question of liability, because the legislation that has it just passed, or it's about to pass, amending Section 230 in the United States to allow essentially for potential liability in cases of human trafficking posts, I think is essentially a big defeat for Silicon Valley in trying to maintain the Section 230 liability as sweeping as it has been. So how that changes the game for companies, and whether there are going to be more exceptions to Section 230, or those are questions we're going to be interested in.
All right. I want to just thank all three of you so much for your time and for being here. Thank you very much for your insights. It's fascinating to hear your perspectives. All three of us have had conversations of a very different order, so I appreciate listening and hearing about your experiences. You did not have to give out your email addresses, but you did. So thank you very much for being gracious with this esteemed assembled group here around that as well. Folks, it's dark out, it's winter, even though we're in LA, but there is libation and refreshments of many types awaiting you in the faculty center, and we welcome you all to join us down there. Things will kick off at 5:30, so you can make a leisurely way down there, and we can also go in groups for those who aren't familiar with the campus. We'll be happy to accompany you. So please, if you have any energy, emotional and otherwise, left at this point in the day, do join us because you earned it. So thank you very much. Thanks once again, everyone. Thank you.